Well, this article, which I co-wrote with Nilsson at the Swedish Defense University, basically tries to help us to understand why the EU was caught so off guard in its relationships to China and Russia at two different stages in its relationship to these two countries not very long ago. And those two sort of incidents, or those two periods, refer back to the diplomatic crisis between the EU and China, 2008 to 2009. And a little bit later, the crisis with Russia, as sort of in the wake of the signature of the free trade agreement with Ukraine, which subsequently led to the Maidan protests and Russia's involvement in Ukraine and its efforts to destabilize the Ukraine. And the main question is that we pose in this article is, how could it be that the EU was so unaware of the changing position of China and Russia vis-a-vis the normative ambitions of the EU? And here the focus is on the EU's sort of self-perception, its international identity as a normative power, and the way in which it constructed its foreign policy actions and orientation, where it sort of had the ambition to socialize both China and Russia into the liberal order, and doing this by creating close relationships to these two countries. And we argue in this article that it's possible to understand why the EU was caught so unprepared for the sort of changing positions of China and Russia vis-a-vis its own international identity, by looking at the EU's role conception as a normative power. And basically what we're arguing is that the EU was so attached to its normative power that it did not see the changes in the position of its two sort of, at the time, still partners, and was able to understand and read their changing, let's say, positions vis-a-vis the international order, and also then the EU's sort of normative power ambitions. And we argue that this had an sort of implications on the EU's foreign policy response at the time, so leading up to the crisis, which we say was inadequate. We are not arguing that the EU could or should have avoided this crisis, because they are deeply down, sort of grounded in very different worldviews. But we think that the EU could have foreseen that, for instance, Russia would have seen an association agreement between EU and Ukraine as a way for the EU to sort of move its positions in Eastern Europe forward, and then sort of impinging on Russia's sort of traditional spheres of influence. And similarly, that the EU did not comprehend that China was not open to EU's socialization ambitions. For instance, the EU was very insistent on trying to introduce better protection for human rights and even some democratic practices in China. And the EU did not simply see that China was not open to those kinds of ambitions any longer. And we basically say that the crisis with the two countries erupted because of the EU's inability to read its partners. So this is the sort of the puzzle that we address. And we show this by looking at official statements, and we look at the official statements both by the EU and the sort of responses to that by Russia and China in two different periods. So both the sort of initial position of the EU, and then the responses of China and Russia, and then what happened when the crisis erupted. What is interesting here, I think, is the theoretical argument, because we say that in order to understand how the EU was so unprepared, or how its view on its partners was clouded, and why it didn't see that the partners' sort of position in the international system was changing, was basically due to the fact that it was kind of imprisoned in its old role conception. And the reasons for that are many, and we show some of them in the article, and it basically has to do with the fact that the EU is not a traditional foreign policy actor, in the sense that it's not a state. So it doesn't argue its foreign policy on the basis of interests, but rather on the basis of what it is, so its international identity. And this has permitted the EU to forge an international identity and a role in the international system, and sort of circumvent the problem that the EU has with the national foreign policies of its member states. So this is an explanation why the EU held so closely to its role conception as a normative power. And another aspect that we show theoretically here is that role theory can use role conceptions in a novel way by actually showing how in a role interplay with antagonistic actors that challenge the role position of the EU in this case, that when they change and when they actually start to challenge the EU's role conception, then the EU's role position changes de facto. And here, even without the EU being fully aware of it, at least in the first period. So we think that this is an interesting way to use role theory, and we think that this will lead to much more dynamic analysis of role theory. We also think that it's interesting to see in two concrete cases how the role expectations of two antagonistic partners actually have a direct effect of the alter position of a role conception, and that is without the sort of the role bearer being able to influence the formulation of its role conception. So we think that this is a novel and interesting way to use role theory, and we think it's very important in, let's say, in this new era we are living now, where the liberal order and the adherence of international actors or states to the liberal order is for sure not to be taken granted any longer. So actually, actors like China and Russia want very different things from international interaction. If they're interested in cooperation, it will be on different principles than those of the liberal order, and that will challenge the view that we have in the West and that Western actors have of the liberal order. And for sure, the EU, as the EU is both a guarantor but also a product of the liberal order. So I think that there are many reasons why we should take the changes to the international system and see them also from a role theoretical perspective, because this kind of new dynamics, or even the competition about which kind of role positions actors should have, is now becoming very, very crucial. And as we see in our two short case studies, we can see like the implications it had for the EU, the fact that China and Russia changed its view on the EU, and therefore the implications of the EU as a foreign policy actor, as it had to adjust to these new challenges or demands. And to sort of finalize the analysis that we do in this article is to say that the EU obviously understood, when the crisis erupted, the EU understood more or less what was happening and changed a little bit or changed quite radically its position towards Russia and China, but in two different ways. So what it had in common was that it gave up its socialization ambitions. So the EU understood that it can no longer sort of pretend with with credibility to be able to socialize either China or Russia into the liberal order, and that it needs to adjust its foreign policy and in some ways become a more normal foreign policy actor, without at the same time giving up its identity as a normative power. So here the EU is a little bit in a conundrum, knowing how to sort of balance these two contradictory demands. And when it comes to Russia and China and the crisis, which are now more or less a decade old, we see that the EU in regard to China reformulated its strategic partnership with China, which it maintained, it never gave up, and it formulated it to becoming much more of a traditional bilateral relationship based on diplomatic practices and sort of squaring let's say the different ambitions of China of a sovereign-based foreign policy and the EU's normative-based foreign policy. And here the EU has gone along quite far to sort of recognize China's position when it comes to international norms. And when it comes to Russia, obviously the EU's response after the sort of annexation of Russia of the Crimea and its involvement in Donbass and Luhansk, then the EU took a firm position, slapping sanctions on Russia, which are still in place today. So I think that with the article we show that the EU was caught off guard, hadn't read or hadn't thought through the implications of the change in position of China and Russia vis-a-vis the international order and the liberal order, and then had not gauged the fact that that would have a quite severe implication on its own role conception. And today the EU is kind of wrestling what to do with its own international identity and how to promote that still in a much more hostile environment. Yes, I think I will answer this question a little bit as just a continuation of what I said before. And I think that the EU has no illusions any longer about the position of Russia and how Russia sees itself. And that there is very little trust between the EU institutions on the one hand and most member states of the EU, but not all, vis-a-vis Russia. So there's very little trust among, let's say, the majority of the member states and the EU institutions and Russia. And as we know, the strategic partnership was suspended in the beginning of this decade, and there is no chance for that, for the moment at least, to be sort of reenacted or put in place again. I think in general, as we know, the relations are very frosty, and the EU and its member states are well aware that Russia tries to influence many of the member states today. I mean, or all member states, but in very different ways. And in some ways, the EU now, as I said before, has to figure out how to behave towards Russia. So for the EU as a normative power, it has to, in some ways, become not less normative, but maybe change its foreign policy. So its foreign policy takes more traditional, let's say, dimensions. And for instance, as I mentioned before, the sanctions were enacted in 2014, and they're periodically reviewed, and they have up until now always been reinstated again. And I don't see that they will not sort of continue for the foreseeable future. And then when it comes to Russian interference, I think the EU and its member states, again, is very clear now about the fact that they need to protect their open societies, which is a contradiction in terms in some ways, but it needs to protect them from the Russian influence, in particular in the way in which Russia tries to destabilize European democracies and sort of prompt the democratic and political processes in most of the EU member states to become less open and maybe more inward looking, and also to refute some of the principles of the liberal order. So we can see a rise in right-wing populism in more or less all EU member states, which in some ways are directly or indirectly helped by sort of Russian ambitions. We see meddling in general elections and other kinds of elections, and we see also Russian influence in the economic area. And then, of course, we also see security threats, especially cyber-based security threats from or on behalf of Russia. So here I see that the EU is under no illusion that it needs to be cautious towards Russia, not closing any doors, but still be very cautious and in some ways also be quite suspicious. Then there is, of course, a difference between the majority of the member states and some other member states which have a much more, let's say, or strive towards a much more positive relationship with Russia. And this sometimes causes problems in the EU's ability to come to common positions. For the moment, it has not yet influenced EU's decisions, the periodic decisions on sanctions, but we can see that it still has an influence over a number of issues, and member states are not always in agreement. So this is what I see as the weak part of the EU, and obviously Russia is well aware of that and sort of is able to play some member states off as Trojan horses within the EU, within the EU institutions and within the sort of policy-making processes in the EU.